You out here for this event today, and I want to thank all of you for being with us today to honor the legacy of Madeleine K Albright, or MKA, as we all like to call her. I'm so grateful that we are joined by Madeleine's daughter, Alice, and by her grandsons, David and Daniel, Bose, and by other honored guests. And I want to take you back. As we're sitting here, I'd like to take all of you back to the 1990s. And that was when I first met Madeleine. I was a Foreign Service officer stationed in Geneva, and Secretary Albright came to town for a conference. And I had long admired her from afar, but this was going to be my first time seeing her in person and up close. And I literally was blown away. She was such a force, and you could feel her presence as soon as she walked in the room. And when she spoke, people listened. And when she was in the room, people wanted her to listen to them. And I remember thinking to myself, this is what leadership looks like. And this is how I want to be viewed as I move through my career in diplomacy. Little did I know that I would be sitting in the same chair one day that she sat in. Madeleine Albright might have been small in stature, but she was huge in status. And that status was not inevitable for her. In fact, it really was unlikely. Madeleine grew up in the shadow of conflict. She fled Nazi invasion and communist oppression and came to the United States as a refugee. But from humble beginnings, she reached heights that no woman had ever attained, becoming the first woman to serve as Secretary of State. 63 men had done that job before her, but she came to Foggy Bottom and made that office and that position her own. She put human rights and democracy at the center of every issue, and she quickly earned the respect of the department, of our allies, and even our adversaries. And while she was the first, she was determined not to be the last. Madeleine Albright made sure the doors she worked so hard to open would never, ever be shut again, so that other women could follow in her footsteps, like our 66th Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, and our 67th Secretary of State, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who is here with us today. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for joining us. The world has lost an icon. I saw that on the day of her passing. We were in this room, and so many people paid tribute to her memory. And then the tributes and memories started pouring in to the U.S. mission, representing countries from all around the world. But I'm grateful that in these challenging times, as our values and our international order are being tested, her example will endure. And when I sit in this chamber behind the placard of the United States, I look to that example of how to be grateful, graceful, and also firm, how to be kind and also strong. She taught us all what it means to devote our lives to the service of others, and I mean our entire lives. She never stopped teaching, mentoring, speaking out for what she believed in, right up until the very end. Madeleine Albright was famous for her pins that she wore, each with a different story and symbolism. And as I said before, I will always have her sitting on my shoulder, guiding me, guiding my path, guiding my thoughts as we work some of the most difficult issues around the world. I will miss my friend and role model, Madeleine K Albright. Throughout her long career in public service, Madeleine Albright was a committed champion of multilateralism and a strong believer in the need for a robust United Nations capable of standing up for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And I am therefore honored to invite Secretary General Antonio Guterres to offer his reflections. Secretary General.
Dear Alice Albright, dear Daniel and David, Madam Secretary, dear Ambassador, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to join in this tribute to Madeleine Albright, an exemplary diplomat, a champion of multilateralism, and a very dear friend. I had the privilege of working with Secretary Albright over many years, both in and out of government. And in every one of our encounters, I was always struck by the sharpness of her insights and her equally sharp wit, and touched by her warmth, grace, and humanity. She was a distinguished scholar of international relations, but both her scholarship and statecraft were informed by lived experience. Twice forced to flee her native Prague as a child, she arrived in the United States as a refugee and rose to become one of the most influential foreign policy leaders of a generation. The story of her life is the story of the turmoil of 20th century Europe, the terror of totalitarianism, and the horror of war. But her story is also a powerful example of the invaluable contribution of refugees to countries that welcome them. Her tremendous skills as a diplomat derived in no small measure from her extraordinary personal history, her fluency in many languages, and familiarity with different cultures. And I think it is also why she felt so at home in our United Nations. Although when she first arrived here as US Ambassador, she was the only woman in the entire Security Council, or as she described it, 14 suits and a skirt. An enduring part of her rich legacy will surely be the many ways in which she was a trailblazer for women. At UN, she led the American delegation to the landmark conference on women in Beijing in 1995. And long after she left public service, she continued to work tirelessly to promote gender equality, mentoring and inspiring an entire generation of women leaders. Dear friends, in a speech exactly 25 years ago, Madeleine Albright outlined a stark choice, and I quote, "We will either be known as the world-class ditherers who stood by while the seeds of renewable global conflict were sown, or as the generation that took strong measures to forge alliances, deter aggression, and keep the peace." End of quote. That warning has an eerie resonance in today's world. At a time when we are facing the most combustible geopolitical landscape in decades, the highest number of violent conflicts since World War II, unprecedented levels of hunger, poverty, and humanitarian emergencies, and the very foundations and norms of international law are put into question, at such a time and in such a world, Madeleine Albright, with her dogged determination, tenacious resolve, and abiding conviction in the power of multilateral diplomacy, is a reference and a guiding light. May her memory be a blessing, and may her example be an inspiration for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. I now invite Abdullah Shahid, the President of the General Assembly, to make remarks.
Your Excellency Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations, members of the Albright family, Mr. Secretary General, Madam Secretary Clinton, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to join you in celebrating the life and legacy of the late Madeleine Albright. Throughout her storied and illustrious career, Secretary Albright played many roles, so much so that it is near impossible in a few moments to truly capture the depth and scale of the work that she accomplished. Her journey from being Madeleine K to Madeleine is simply extraordinary. As a refugee and migrant who fled persecution as a child, as a staunch supporter of multilateralism, and in her own words, a child of the United Nations, as an environmentalist who saw the US signing the Kyoto Protocol, as perhaps the only person who could teach Macarena in the Security Council, perhaps as a woman who rose to the highest levels and demonstrated the power of women in power, she will be remembered as a torchbearer of gender equality. Secretary Albright was the first female US Secretary of State and the highest ranking woman in the history of the United States government at the time of her appointment. I'm reminded of her quote that there is no shortage of worthwhile work to be done and no surprise of seasons in which to do it. As a diplomat, she demonstrated star quality with dignity. She was known to be firm but flexible. She was perhaps one of the rare diplomats who made diplomacy understandable to the common people. And I remember her quote, as Secretary, I will do my best to talk about foreign policy, not in abstract terms, but in human terms. As a gender champion and advocate for equality, I'm in awe of all that Secretary Albright has achieved and encouraged by all those who inspired. She herself once stated, "Societies are better off when women are politically and economically empowered." As President of the United Nations General Assembly, I would like to recognize Secretary Albright's firm support for the United Nations and all that it embodies. Referring to herself as multilateral Madeleine, Secretary Albright once said that if the United Nations didn't exist, we would have to invent it. Those words ring as true today as the day they were spoken. Excellencies, dear friends, as we celebrate the life and career of Secretary Albright, I would like to recall the contributions of all the great women pioneers in the field of diplomacy who have negotiated peace agreements, strengthened diplomatic ties, survived threats, and opened the doors for other women to join the diplomatic service. I'm firmly of the view that the time has come for us to recognize the contribution of women in diplomacy. Let us work towards declaring an International Day of Women in Diplomacy in recognition of women such as Madeleine Albright. And lest we forget, there are glass ceilings yet to be shattered. I believe we would all agree that Secretary Albright would fully endorse my call for the next Secretary General of the United Nations to be a woman. I would like to thank Her Excellency Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield and the United States Mission to the UN for organizing this memorial and for the kind invitation for me to speak. As we honor Secretary Albright's deeply inspiring legacy, let us continue her work in favor of a better world, and I thank you.
Thank you, President Shahid. It is now my great honor to welcome Hillary Rodham Clinton, the 67th Secretary of State of the United States, to hear her reflections as a close friend of Madeleine Albright, but also as a close friend of so many of us here in this room. She took on the successor to the job of the United States top diplomat as the third woman Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton.
Good afternoon. Secretary Guterres and President Shahid, my longtime friend, Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield, Alice Albright, David and Daniel, Excellencies, friends, and distinguished guests. Let me start by thanking you for holding this remembrance of Madeleine Albright. In the midst of all that is going on in the world today, it's quite striking that the United Nations would stop for just a little while to recognize someone who loved this institution, believed in its mission, and did everything she could, both on behalf of the United States, but also on behalf of the ideals and values of the UN, to forge the kind of future that we all hope for. Thank you for giving me the honor of joining you to celebrate the extraordinary life and service of Secretary Albright. I was privileged to know her through many seasons of our lives, and she was always in a hurry to do good. Madeleine and I bonded over many things, including, in recent years, the joy of being grandmothers. You know, Daniel and David, nothing made her happier or to light up with that great smile than talking about her grandkids, and nothing made her more determined because of you to help build a better, freer, and safer world. That mission, which animated her entire life, never wavered. In her last memoir, she shared the urgency that she always felt. She wrote, "There is no shortage of worthwhile work to be done, and no surplus of seasons in which to do it." That is the wisdom and hard-won experience of a woman who learned too early in life that life itself is fragile, that freedom can't be taken for granted, that democracy must be defended, peace must be won, and there is no time to waste doing any of that. It is the resolve of the refugee she was, who fled tyranny twice before the age of 11. And it is the determination of a diplomat who knew war and worked to end it. That determination came in handy when my husband named her ambassador to the United Nations in 1993, and then Secretary of State in 1996. Madeleine was irrepressible, wickedly funny, very stylish, and always ready for a laugh. Yes, she did teach the foreign minister of Botswana, the Macarena, at a UN Security Council meeting. She also snuck off from an official visit by the president to Argentina that she accompanied him on to go do the tango in Buenos Aires. There are so many cherished memories. One that I particularly absolutely relish is when Madeleine took me on a memorable walking tour of her beloved Prague in the midst of a driving rainstorm, which left us both laughing so hard that we hardly noticed the rain because the stories and the places were so redolent of the memories and the love that she had for her native land. We spent an evening together at the home of then President and Mrs. Havel, just the four of us having dinner, and I got to listen to them talk about what it meant for their beloved country to be free. Madeleine once said, "I was taught to strive not because there were any guarantees of success, but because the act of striving is in itself the only way to keep faith with life." Madeleine strove tirelessly to tip those scales of justice toward a fairer world for everyone, particularly women. She spent her entire life teaching and mentoring, counseling and cajoling, inspiring and lifting up so many women, so there would be a great stream of women diplomats, women academics, women politicians, women public servants who would be in her wake. Once, when a male diplomat remarked that she'd spent too much time with the other women in the room, Madeleine said to him, "When your government names a woman to head the delegation, I will spend considerable time with her as well." She was impatient for progress, and until the end, still in a hurry to do good, issuing blunt warnings about the dangers posed by authoritarianism and fascism with unwavering moral clarity. During our last phone call, 2 weeks before she died, Madeleine talked about the importance of what the world is doing to rally against the horrific invasion of Ukraine and the urgent work of defending democracy at home and around the world. She knew better than most, and she wanted us to know, and wrote a book about fascism, that it can happen here or anywhere, and that time, courage, determination are essential. So I hope that we will all honor Madeleine's life and legacy by standing against those who would try to compel us to do what they want us to do, the dictators and the demagogues, on the battlefields of Ukraine and beyond. Strengthened by a shared resolve to defend our global community against the evils of war, poverty, and injustice in every form. So thank you for honoring this amazing human being, this memorable diplomat, this extraordinary friend, and let us all strive as she did to be in a hurry to do the most good we can with every season under heaven given to each and every one of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your inspiring words and memories of Madeleine Albright's decades of public service. Madeleine Albright's worldview was shaped by her early wartime life. As a child, you've heard she came to the United States as a refugee, the daughter of a Czech diplomat fleeing Nazi persecution on the eve of World War II. I'm therefore honored to invite Ambassador Jacob Kolinek, the permanent representative of the Czech Republic to the United Nations, to speak.
Well, dear Linda, members of Secretary Albright's family, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. This is a somber moment, but also one from which we can draw much hope and inspiration, as we are gathered here to honor the extraordinary life of an outstanding woman, the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. Marie Jana Korbelová, called Madla or Madeleine by her grandmother, was a native of Prague, born into a family of a Czechoslovak diplomat, Josef Korbel. Together with her family, she came to the United States as a refugee in 1948. Having witnessed the communist coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia, and later in her life, having learned of the tragic fate of her extended family, which was met during the Second World War. I mean, thanks to these experiences, she intimately understood the true essence of the words freedom, democracy, human rights, and security. She understood that these values were something to strive for, to preserve, and even to sacrifice oneself for. With the unique background, she became the first woman at the helm of American diplomacy. Also, that experience gave her a very special insight into the realities of Europe in general and Central Europe in particular. A tireless champion of freedom and human rights, including gender equality, she was the most steadfast ally the democratic Czech Republic could ever hope for and ask for. With no doubt, her determination and commitment were the driving force behind my country, the Czech Republic, joining NATO. Now that we watch in horror the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine, we can fully appreciate how prescient that decision was. The sad news of Madeleine Albright's passing came amidst the worst crisis in Europe since the end of the Cold War. Madeleine Albright was involved in world affairs until the end of her days. She was fully aware of the many grave dangers Europe was facing. She wrote about them, lectured about them, and above all, warned about them. And now, if you allow me briefly on a personal note, I came to know Secretary Albright in a classroom at the Georgetown University. She was a brilliant professor, but the thing that struck me most about her, it wasn't the fact that we could speak to each other in flawless Czech, causing some bewilderment among other students, but rather it was that despite being this larger-than-life foreign policy grandee, she conducted herself with great humility and civility, always willing to help and share her unique insights. I will never forget that, and perhaps also in these trying times, we need this humility and civility. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct belief that we should uphold the values she firmly believed in all her life. May her legacy guide us in these difficult times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Beyond Madeleine Albright's distinguished record of public service, she was, as you heard, also a dedicated teacher and mentor who inspired generations of future leaders. One of her students at Georgetown University was Mr. Kono Taro, a member of the House of Representatives of Japan and former foreign minister. And by the way, she used to always talk about her formers. It was always the former foreign ministers, so she had formers all over the world, and she constantly recognized them. And so Mr. Kono Taro, one of her formers, he was unable to join us today, but was kind enough to provide these recorded remarks. And I'd like to give us a moment to hear his remarks. course, there's always going to be a technical problem. So while we're waiting on this to be fixed, I am now pleased to invite Ms. Judy Collins to perform in honor of Madeleine Albright.
Former Foreign Minister and Defense Minister.
Okay, Judy is going to speak from the podium, and she'd like the volume to be up just a tiny bit.
I think that I will take this off to sing. I've been vaccinated. I have been, I carry the antibodies, and so I'm a safe person. Thank you so much. I want to say I am so honored to be here in this august room, in this moment of celebration and memory of someone we all loved and respected and cared for. I want to thank Madam Clinton and all of the assembled. I'd like to say a special thanks to Alice Albright, who is here. I must tell you a little bit about my relationship with this larger-than-life, amazing woman who was, as Secretary Clinton has said, larger than life and a friend, and had a sense of humor and a sense of the world. You know, it's terribly moving to be in a room where all of you are working to make the world a better place, as she did. She was remarkable. I met her within the White House in the first few months of President Clinton's presidency, and she and I hit it off immediately. And we actually spent a little time across the street. We've just come from across the street today in this beautiful weather. And she said to me, she took my arm as we came across the street to the General Assembly, and she said, "I have a plan for you." I think she had a plan for all of us. And most of us found ourselves in her sway in one way or another, as well as the world did, and still will. And she said, "My plan for you is to take you back over there to the home and the offices of UNICEF." And I said, "Why would that be?" And she said, "Well, I think you could become a spokesperson for UNICEF." And I said, "Well, I'm not sure that I can step into the footprints of Audrey Hepburn or any others." And she said, "No, but you're Judy Collins." And I said, "Whatever you tell me to do, I will do." That's how we were with Madeleine. I think most of us felt that way. And so she brought me up to the offices of UNICEF on a Friday afternoon. We met, and then we had some lunch, and then we went up to UNICEF. And the president and Madeleine said to me, "Now, here's a book that we want you to present. This is a book called I Dream of Peace." UNICEF started a landmine education program for children. They started it in Mozambique originally, but then they left off or continued, but began to have a real program that affected hundreds of thousands of children in the former Yugoslavia. And the book was the artwork that came out of this program. It consisted of 7 lessons for children in which they would start drawing. And of course, the first drawing would be bombs flying from the sky. And after the 7th, finally, there would be usually a picture of a child with a flower and the sun shining. It was meant to make these children feel something of the safety that they were meant to feel, but they could not feel. And she said, "I want you to introduce this book. It's coming out on Monday, and Harry Smith is going to introduce it, and you're going to go down to CBS, and we'd like you to write a song. This was Friday. And I said, of course. You know, I was young then, very much younger than I am today. And so I went on the show, and I sang a bit of the song that I had written over the weekend. The song is called I Dream of Peace, and the verse of it, the chorus rather, goes, when I close my eyes, I dream of peace. I dream of flowers on the hill. I dream I see my mother smiling. When I close my eyes, I dream of peace. And from that point, I went to, with my husband, Louis Nelson, I went to the former Yugoslavia a couple of times. We went during the war in '94, and we went back in '97. But it was all with the guidance of this remarkable woman and her life of service, of dedication. She and I had a lot of things in common. For instance, we both went to school in Denver, so we shared a love of the mountains. And I was privileged to be able to spend time with her when she was the head of UNICEF and had the parties at the Waldorf, and they were wonderful. And I want to say that singing for her today in her memory is a great privilege, and I'd like to have you join me as I sing a song that's probably known by now around the world. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. And I'd love to have you join me and sing it with me. You know, you could sing the melody or the harmony or another song entirely if you want, or in another language entirely if you want. And we'll sing it a little higher, shall we? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. God bless you all, and God bless Madeleine Albright.
I'm hoping now, after that beautiful song, and thank you so much, Judy. Your music is so well known to so many of us, and to have you here with us today, perform in Madeleine's honor is an extraordinary, extraordinary gift. I don't know if you have the video now. We do? Okay.
Good afternoon, Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield, Excellencies, and distinguished members of the global diplomatic community. My name is Kono Taro, former Foreign Minister and Defense Minister of Japan. And today, I am representing former students of Professor Albright. As a freshman in Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, I enrolled in a freshman seminar titled American Foreign Policy Process, taught by Professor Albright. I came to Georgetown with a SAT English score of 380 out of 800. So in the first class of the seminar, where American students kept talking and talking, I sat there listening. When the class was over, Professor Albright said to me if I did not intend to make a contribution to the class, I did not have to come back to the class. I was shocked and tried to explain that I was from Japan and did not speak English well. Then she said, "That's your problem." So from the next class, I started talking at the beginning of the class before any American students said anything. That was the only way I could speak. I survived, and actually it turned out to be very enjoyable. She invited us to her house for the last class. She cooked dinner for us, and after the dinner, we had a simulation game emulating the Panama Canal Treaty negotiation. She played God, but we failed to reach an agreement, and a frustrated terrorist group destroyed the canal at the end. We had to write a paper for the seminar. Professor reminded us that we were just freshmen, not scholars or historians yet, and told us to pick a topic suitable for a freshman in the undergraduate study. So I wrote a paper on why the famous Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, Senator Albright, lost to a young challenger, Mr. Dale Bumpers, in the Democratic primary in Arkansas. The paper played a role in history. When she was the Secretary of State, my father was appointed Foreign Minister of Japan. After their first telephone conversation, the Foreign Ministry issued a press release saying the Secretary and the Minister talked about an important topic in the bilateral relationship. That evening, Foreign Minister told me it was about my paper and the grade on it. I was already elected to the Parliament of Japan when Secretary Albright visited Japan. The American ambassador invited me to the residence to see her. I was standing straight up in front of her, and someone said to me, I was just like a student in front of a teacher. I guess I was. Secretary Albright understood the importance of the US-Japan bilateral relationship when the alliance was being challenged as the United States was reviewing its security policy after the end of the Cold War and the trade war was raging. Secretary Albright visited Japan 5 times and met with foreign ministers numerous times. And when she was in office, not only bilateral economic issues concerning trade, deregulation, and structural reforms were mostly resolved, but also the two governments were successful in deepening the security cooperation with a new guideline for US-Japan defense cooperation. In her memoir, Hell and Other Destinations, she wrote, "In 2018, I even received a decoration, the Grand Cordon of the Order of the Rising Sun, from Japan's foreign minister and my former student, Taro Kono." She told me she wanted to have her former foreign minister's group in Tokyo when COVID was over. I asked if she would like to do it this year, and I received her last email on February 15th this year. She said, "Check back with me in a month or 2. Her legacy will live on, and I am forever grateful for her guidance and leadership. Thank you very much.
During Madeleine's 4-decade tenure at Georgetown University, She taught over 2,000 students, many of whom would go on to a life of public service, as you just heard from Mr. Kono. So to reflect further on her academic life and impact on her students, I'd like to welcome Dr. Joel Hellman, Dean of Georgetown University Welch School of Foreign Service.
Secretary General Guterres, President of the Assembly, Shahid, Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield, Secretary Clinton, members of the Albright family, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. In January, I received a call from Madeleine Albright some 5 days before our spring semester at Georgetown University began. She told me with a heavy heart that she would not be able to teach her scheduled course, America's National Security Toolkit. She apologized for telling me at such a late date, but as she said, the one thing I tried hardest not to give up was my classroom. Then, ever the optimist, or what she always liked to say, an optimist that worries a lot, she assured me that she would be back in the fall. This fall, Madeleine Albright would have celebrated her 40th anniversary teaching at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Over those years, she inspired generations of students not only to serve the world, but to understand the world and engage the world. And so many of her students, some of whom you've heard today, went on to do just that. A legacy that is almost incalculable in its reach. For all her accomplishments, Madeleine Albright always said that first and foremost, she was a professor. She was a fixture on the campus. She liked to joke that her home just 2 blocks away from Georgetown University was a stop on the official campus tour. Her course on the National Security Toolkit became a rite of passage for all generations of students from the school. Its highlight was a role-playing simulation of a foreign policy crisis that inspired fear in all who came before her, as she always played the president, decked out in a flight jacket and an Air Force One cap. She delighted in throwing sneaky curveballs into the exercises. The prime minister was just assassinated. A missile test went astray. She challenged her students to think on their feet and to recognize the complex contingencies and especially the critical importance of human relationships that shape real-world foreign policy crises, lessons that she knew from hard-won experience. Regardless of her many commitments around the world, Albright rarely missed a class, and she always made time to meet all of her students, all 2,000 of them through the course of her career. She read all of their papers. She combined a scholar's appreciation for the arc of history, an immigrant's belief in the great promise of America, a woman's understanding of what it means to shatter glass ceilings, and she shattered so many of them, and a seasoned diplomat's ability to disarm anyone who dared to underestimate her with wit, with charm, and grace. She had a war chest of zingers for every occasion, and she had a lifetime of stories to illustrate the complexities of security and diplomacy. Her deep commitment to the essential values of democracy and human rights, as well as her understanding of the underlying forces that are necessary to sustain and protect those values, remained her greatest passion until the very last days of her life. Indeed, she raised her voice in the New York Times just a few months ago to warn of the tragedy now before us in this brutal war on the European continent. More than anyone else, she helped to shape the post-Cold War era, a remarkable period that saw the highest rates of global poverty reduction, the greatest advances in the well-being of women and children, and the lowest levels of conflict in a century. Madeleine Albright left a deep impact on the world. She became a genuine icon of all that is best in the American story. And in the outpouring of grief that accompanied news of her passing, There were so many tributes to that impact on the national and global stage. But I can attest from the hundreds of testimonials of her recent and former students of the impact she had on individuals. Each had a story of how she inspired them to serve. And more often than not, each had a very specific story of how she went out of their way to help them, to encourage them, to advise them, occasionally to mother them if needed, or to kick them in the pants when she thought they needed to do better. Through her teaching and mentoring, she left us a generation of leaders committed to keeping up her fight for democracy, human rights, and dignity for all. We are forever indebted to her, and we will miss her deeply. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel. It is now my great privilege to invite Alice Albright to share her reflections of her mother. And as you join us at the podium, Alice, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you and your family for sharing Secretary Albright with all of us.
Good afternoon. Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield, my family and I are so grateful to you for hosting this very special commemoration. Secretary General Guterres, President Shahid, Secretary Clinton, Foreign Minister Kano, Ambassador Kulhanek, Dean Hellman, thank you for your words of remembrance, for your friendship, and all that you do to advance the goals that you and my mother share. I also want to thank my mother's dear friend, Judy Collins, for her wonderful musical tribute. Thank you. Your Excellencies, I'm deeply moved to be standing here today in this hall and to have the opportunity to reflect on what this institution meant to my mom and to our entire family. As many of you know, my grandfather was a Czechoslovak diplomat and an ardent supporter of democracy. When his country's freedom was extinguished by a communist coup in February 1948, he found a lifeline through his service on United Nations Commission set up to address the disputed status of Kashmir. During his time on this commission, he arranged for my grandmother, my mother, and my aunt and uncle to travel to America. And so, on November 11th, Armistice Day, 1948, my 11-year-old mother arrived in New York Harbor, sailing past the Statue of Liberty on the SS America, along with her mom, her sister, Kathy, and her brother, John. My mom's family moved to Long Island, not far from the then UN's temporary headquarters at Lake Success, and my grandfather joined them by Christmas. With no home to return to safely, my grandfather asked the then U.S. Permanent Representative Warren Austin to help secure the right for his family to stay in the United States. 4 months later, in June 1949, they were granted political asylum, the chance to live a settled life, and eventually become American citizens after enduring years of war and turmoil. Once in the United States, my mom wanted nothing more than to fit in and become an American teenager. She learned the ropes from her then elementary school classmate, Winnie Freund, who became her lifelong best friend and is here with us today. When, some 45 years later, my mother took up her role here as the U.S. ambassador to the UN, it was never lost on her that had it not been for the generosity of the U.S. and the principles that the UN stood for, she most likely would not have been alive. And that has not been lost on us, her daughters and her grandchildren either. My sisters and I learned of my mom's appointment to the United Nations with the secrecy required of the occasion but also the excitement of a mother wanting to share a historical moment with her daughters. Mom called us one night in December 1992 and asked that we figure out how to get to Little Rock, Arkansas early the next morning, but was not able to tell us why. You can imagine the looks we received from our bosses, our respective bosses, when we asked to take a day off, but were not able to give any reason whatsoever. The next day, President-elect Clinton nominated her to be the next U.S. ambassador to the UN. Several weeks after that, it all became very real when we had seats at President Clinton's inauguration and were invited to join the incoming cabinet and their families in the president's viewing box to watch the parade. Once she settled into New York, Mom went to work, building alliances with her fellow permanent representatives, often through wonderful lunches and dinners at her apartment. She was not daunted by the increasing security requirements around her, even following the World Trade Center bombing that happened in February 1993, just a few weeks into her term. She still insisted on seeing the work of the UN in person and showing her gratitude for the peacekeeping forces, and traveled frequently to visit them in their missions. Mom would also take almost daily trips, either by train or plane, between Washington and New York as a member of the Principals Committee of the National Security Council to help build support for the work of the UN in the post-Cold War era. Nothing made Mom more proud to sit in this world body behind a nameplate that read United States. She knew from personal experience why the UN's commitment to freedom, to human rights, to dignity, to the rights of nations large and small was so important. And with her appointment, she had the chance to work with all of you and your predecessors towards achieving these noble and critical goals. As a family, we will be forever grateful to the UN, which helped give our mom, and thus our entire family, a home here in the US, and then a cherished set of memories to follow. Thank you so much, all of you, for recognizing her and her legacy today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. And I'm so glad you were able to be here with us today and pay our respects and honor to the legacy of your mother. I now invite everyone to reflect on the many ways Madeleine Albright meant to us all as you watch these photos and footage of her. Madeleine Albright was a mother, she was a grandmother, but she was also a pioneer, a role model, a leader, a diplomat, a professor, a mentor, a colleague, and a friend. We remember her today. Her passing is a great loss to diplomacy and to the causes of freedom, human rights, and multilateralism. I thank you for joining us today.